Hi, I'm Cash the Composer, and today I'm retracing the steps of Lavinia Fisher, the subject of my next musical. Her story has been perverted by those seeking to profit from the fantastic, from storytellers stretching the truth to tourists, to churches spreading propaganda, to lazy journalists neglecting to do their due diligence. I want to do this right. I want to find her truth and give her justice. I've done a deep dive into the facts of her life, and I'm taking the time to walk in her footsteps quite literally, to see where her story actually took place, from its beginning to its gnarly end. If you want to learn more about the details of her story, to see my adaptation of her story into a new musical, or are just a fan of history and theater, hit that red button to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to be notified of my future videos. Today, we're in North Carolina walking along the Yadkin River, specifically along the Tuckertown Reservoir, just below a place formerly called Mott's Falls. This is the site of the estate of one Colonel George Fisher, a war veteran who happened to own two slaves named Sally and Lavinia Fisher. This is where Lavinia's story begins, on the banks of the water looking out into the blue. This is where she worked, a slave, and this is where she fell in love with her captor's nephew. According to a deed of sale marked 1810, George sold these two women to a Dr. Joseph Glover down in Charleston, South Carolina. There is a famous house where this doctor lived just down the road, but it wasn't completed until several years later. It is likely that Lavinia worked on that property, but she would have lived here at his residence at the time until she was freed. At some point, John Fisher purchased her freedom and her sister's for $500 apiece. It was at this point that the two took up residence here at the site of the 6-mile Wayfarer house. They ran this inn together successfully for some amount of time, despite the crime in the surrounding area. On the property a few hundred yards from the inn, she buried her sister, likely only shortly after obtaining their freedom. Here, she was kicked out of the house and assaulted in front of her home by a lynch mob before they burned her home to the ground on February 18th, 1819. Here we are at the Old City Jail where Lavinia and her husband were wrongfully incarcerated following their imprisonment by the mob under the dominion of Sheriff Nathaniel Cleary. We went over the conditions of their time here in a video a few weeks ago, if you want to hear more about all that, but to summarize, it was inhumane, but at least they were together. This is the site of the old Charleston courthouse. It had been in use since the 1790s, almost brand new at the time of their rather public trial. It was here that the witnesses, David Ross and John Peoples, testified against the couple on May 10th, 1819. Back at the jail, on the second story, Lavinia watched as her husband escaped out the window, unable to follow, on September 13th, 1819. She would wait for him to return and free her once more, but the price for her freedom was simply too steep, so he returned not to free her, but to die with her. This is where a grocer, one Mr. Bull, spotted the escaped John Fisher and alerted the authorities September 16th, 1819. John had been stealing pocket watches, jewelry, anything he could get his hands on to try to gather a bribe to free his bride, but to no avail. Along the water here, John and his co-conspirator hid under an overturned boat, choosing to stay rather than to escape, purely for the sake of his devotion to his Lavinia. On January 17th, 1820, John and Lavinia were sentenced to death by the Constitutional Court. This is the Unitarian Church where Reverend Samuel Gilman was an ordained pastor. He would witness Lavinia's death in the very first year of his employ and write a letter to a friend in Boston lamenting the loss of them and their love, condemning the use of capital punishment. This is the site of the Trinity Methodist Church prior to its move in 1926, where Reverend Israel Munns took up the mantle. Munns attended to Lavinia and John's co-conspirator and landlord, William Hayward, up until his death. I should also mention the Methodist Episcopal Church, where Reverend Joseph Galuchat preached. He may not have actually been involved in Lavinia's life or death, but the Methodist Church spread propaganda claiming that he did have some involvement several decades later, along with several members of his parish, to some unknown end, and he may well have been in attendance. It was this propaganda that painted Lavinia as a villainous murderess, rather than as the victim of the story. And this is the Baptist Church, where Reverend Richard Furman had his employ, and he was the primary contact for our couple, meant to help them come to terms with their situation. However, he focused primarily on John's rehabilitation and ignored Lavinia because he was a racist hole. These were the sites of just a few of the various priests who are noted to have attended to John and Lavinia Fisher, clergy who, regardless of their feelings towards their innocence, their guilt, their sex, or the color of their skin, felt this couple deserved to have a connection to God. And here we are back at the jail one last time. Now, though the pair received a stay of execution after another man confessed to their supposed crimes, they remained in the jail for another 2 weeks, heading to the gallows February 18th, 1820, exactly a year after their initial incarceration. They were loaded into a carriage and led to meet their fate, which, according to the Charleston Courier, was just without the lines on Meeting Street Road between the hours of 12 and 4 o'clock. Here we are on the intersection of Meeting and Line Street. 800 yards north of Line Street on a hill east of Meeting Street, we will find the site of the execution. This is where the pair shared an embrace before falling to their deaths, nooses around their necks. Their bodies were interred beneath our feet here in what was, at the time, a potter's field. This field, now the site of the Medical University of South Carolina, formerly the South Carolina Medical College, was under the dominion of the South Carolina Medical Society, the president of which was none other than Dr. Glover, the former owner of poor Lavinia. He would have been the one to authorize the removal of her body from this grave, and it was in the property of the medical college that her head was severed from her body, her skull split open, and studied before being hung on the wall at the adjacent museum. Here she stayed off and on display until her removal in the late 1900s, when her body was returned to the family of the man who dug her up in the first place. And that is where Lavinia's story ends, at least for now. And here we are, back on the bank of a river, this time the Ashley River, just a few blocks away from my home. I like to think Lavinia might have looked out at these same waters and found peace in the flowing river, the same way I do, the same way a lot of people do. These are the facts of Lavinia's life and death, as best I can tell. These are the places she lived, the places she found herself trapped time and time again. Hers was a life of incarceration, of bars and chains, of yearning for freedom that even in death she could never find. She was not much older than I am now when she was killed, and somehow those 28 years of life were twisted, turned into a fiction. I traced the origins of all of these falsehoods in a video a few weeks ago. You can check that out if you'd like to see how all the crazy myths got started. That's all for now, and I'll see you all next time. Bye, y'all.